proposition. Now, I'm sure you've heard things like the EU is banning memes, and you're wondering, what'll happen to Pepe and all of these other memes, and what happens to people who do remixes of songs and post other people's music online, and this is the type of situation that I see usually getting reduced to some insane extreme that isn't at all representative of the actual legislation. And it's usually just because it's some, clickbaity thing that was taken out of context, and it triggers the emotions of people, and it captures their attention. I mean, a good example of this in the news recently is the zero tolerance policy on the border, which really just means we're going to enforce our laws equally, and the family separation issue. Okay, I mean, we're at a point where WAPO is saying you can call the border centers concentration camps. And even though they say that you have to apply the history with care, it doesn't matter. Okay, unless you radically redefine concentration camps, thus removing it from the historical connotation altogether, they're not concentration camps. I mean, this should give you an idea of how the media will take one point and reduce it to something that's clickbaity and emotional. I mean, Dianne Feinstein, I believe from California, said that the US isn't Nazi Germany, as if that actually had to be said. And this is just one example among a countless number of other examples, but I'm not trying to bog this video down with examples of the media being extreme because, I mean, that's obvious enough to anyone paying attention. But my point is that I wanted to make sure that people weren't misreading Article 11 and Article 13 and thinking something will happen that can't happen the current way that the laws are set up, even with something like this EU copyright law. I mean, an example of a story that is similar to this, that is a legitimate concern, is Bill C-16 in Canada, which worked to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and compel speech, even though it had this veil of compassion wrapped around it. And it became law last year. I mean, there's real concern around it just because of how vague it is, and the fact that it's a very slippery slope. But it's the same issue with Article 11 and 13 of this proposed EU copyright proposal. And the slope that it creates is a black diamond, okay? The average person can very easily be snatched up in the jaws of this monster, whereas Bill C-16 is a bit more difficult to nab the average person, even though, I mean, make no mistake about it, it certainly could go that direction if they so choose. But in its current form, it's not going to just snatch up the average person. So let's get into the content of these articles, and we'll start with Article 11 just because it numerically comes first, and it's something that people are talking about much less than Article 13. So Article 11 has been called a link tax. Basically, getting online platforms to pay a license fee to put a link to the original publishers of the work. And it's designed to push money and, in a roundabout way, support to vital online publications, or what are deemed vital online publications. But given the fact that Article 11 doesn't even define what a link is, and it actually decentivizes people from sharing articles, I mean, Article 11 will do the exact opposite of what they're hoping it does, or what they're saying they're hoping it does. And the other thing is, smaller outlets won't be able to pay for this license in most cases. And when you have news outlets that span all of the 28 countries that fall under the EU rule, I mean, as Julia Rita from the European Parliament points out, instead of one Europe-wide law, we'd have 28, with the most extreme becoming the de facto standard. To avoid being sued, international internet platforms would be motivated to comply with the strictest version implemented by any member state. And that's true. I mean, otherwise you'd have to have separate social media platforms for different countries, and that would largely destroy the purpose of social medias. Not to mention, the reason that this affects the rest of the world outside of the EU is because we use a lot of the same platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I don't know. I don't really know what the kids are into these days. I feel like I'm getting old because I have no idea what they're really into. But regardless, there are platforms shared between the EU and the rest of the world, okay? These platforms will have to conform to the most radical interpretations of the law, meaning that the platforms as a whole will have to change. And it's also worth pointing out how similar this legislation is to the proposed gun laws that the left keeps putting out, at least in America. I mean, the legislation put forward would do nothing to stop the problems that they're actually complaining about, and that just shows, the deeper morality of what they're really pushing for. But, stealing a news article and playing it off as your own, or committing plagiarism to some degree, is already illegal. Not to mention, this type of action has already taken place in Germany and Spain. They've already had this link tax. And the big platforms just boycotted news from those countries until those countries were forced to just give out free licenses to the US companies. So, will we see a repeat of that? Will the EU just roll over and hand out free licenses to these platform giants? And then, the smaller guys won't get these free licenses. And now the market's even more destabilized because Gab and BitChute and DTube and these other small platforms, it just makes it that much harder to compete against the huge companies. I mean, we talk about trying to move away from Facebook and YouTube, and this would just put a squash on all of that. And to throw out another complication, just because a certain platform has a link license doesn't mean that a link that's posted up on their platform can now just be freely reposted anywhere else, okay? If Facebook has a license, but Gab doesn't, then you can't take a link from Facebook and post it up on Gab unless Gab has a license for that specific piece of work, for that particular story. I mean, it's just a route we don't want to have the EU go down, because if you thought that YouTube and Twitter and Facebook were bad now, just wait until their position in the platform monopoly is further secured. Okay, then they have to worry even less about a mass exodus due to restrictive or detrimental actions that the company takes. So that's Article 11. And it's even stupider than Article 13, okay? It's just not the article that bans memes, so people don't fixate on it as much. But, I mean, it's still, it's arguably more stupid than Article 13, but anyways, moving on. Article 13 is the one that everybody is really talking about. And I mean, Article 11, it linked back to some legislation from 2001 and 2012, I believe it was. So it's not quite as cut and dry as Article 13. But for the sake of clarity here, I'm going to read out Section 1, part of Article 13, which isn't long. It's necessary so you see where my interpretation is coming from. I mean, Article 11, it says in not as many words that member states should provide publishers of press publications with the rights to use those press publications. So, I mean, fair use is out of the question right away. And when you put it in the full context, it's without a doubt a link tax. But anyways, Article 13 says information society service providers that store and provide to the public access to large amounts of works or other subject matter uploaded by their users shall, in cooperation with right holders, take measures to ensure the functioning of agreements concluded with right holders for the use of their works or other subject matter, or to prevent the availability on their services of works or other subject matter identified by right holders through the cooperation with the service providers. Those measures, such as the use of effective content recognition technologies, shall be appropriate and proportionate. The service providers shall provide right holders with adequate information on the functioning and the deployment of the measures, as well as, when relevant, adequate reporting on the recognition and use of the works and other subject matter. I mean, you can clearly see that there's more here. There's 2 other sections below it, but it's far less relevant than part 1. So they say platforms that store and provide large amounts of material uploaded by their users will be subject to an agreement with the right holder for use of that material. Then, without hiding it at all, they flat out talk about content recognition technologies for the purpose of monitoring what content people are posting, and it's all in the pursuit of enforcing the EU copyright law. I mean, prior to this, platforms were protected from users who uploaded copyrighted content, but it's because they were merely using the platform as a conduit for that content. But now, those platforms aren't protected, and they'll need teams of people and new algorithms and just new structures to what they're doing to constantly be catching things in real time. I mean, that'll cost millions of dollars for a platform. And once again, just showing how this just further monopolizes the social media market and all of the platforms involved with that. And if a platform can't handle the monitoring, then it'll result in fines that can easily hit the range of hundreds of millions of dollars, basically making sure that nothing but Google and Facebook can truly survive. And if other platforms manage to survive, they'll be weakened so heavily that they can't compete in any real way with Google and Facebook and some of the other big giants. But, you know, beyond this, perhaps the largest flaw in Article 13 is that there's no real mention of fair use at all. I mean, this is just a broad sweeping measure that's poorly defined and extremely invasive. And it's designed at its core to push power to those at the top of this monopoly by disguising it as a detriment, really, to those people at the top of the monopoly. And it's going to push power to the government in the form of control over mediums that people use to communicate. And if you thought that surveillance was bad now, I mean, just wait until they have to monitor everything posted, no matter how small or insignificant. I mean, this is where we've gotten to. So the question of why I'm covering this, I mean, it should be partially clear by now because of the obvious implications. Because, you know, when I post links to articles or I post snippets of articles in my videos, as I have in every single video up to now, you know, YouTube will need to start cracking down on that unless they find some loophole. But when you're talking about a platform being used by people all over the world, including the EU, I just don't see a way around that. I mean, the way it's looking right now is that there will be a full Parliament vote on this on July 5th. And if most of Parliament rejects it, then it goes back for revisions and amendments that MEPs can vote on. And I don't know, truthfully, the whole legal system in Europe is so foreign compared to the American legal system because I still don't understand why Brexit hasn't happened yet. Like, the people voted on it back in 2016. We're halfway through 2018. And granted, I haven't given Brexit as much attention recently as Article 11 and Article 13, but still, it seems like the system is set up in a way that safeguards the government, but not the people. And in America, it's the inverse of that. It's the reverse, despite obvious bouts of corruption that pop up. But I don't know, it seems like the EU, their laws are set up in a way that kind of gerrymander the system to be in favor of the government. So that's all that I really have to say on any of this. You know, if you live in one of the 28 countries under the jurisdiction of the EU, call your MEPs and tell them how you feel. I mean, contact them any way that's legally possible and express your distaste with the current pushes for government overreach far beyond just the EU. I mean, the EU is stepping so far outside of their own domain here that I don't see how this could get passed in its current state. But I mean, one of the only reasons that I'm really talking about this now is because it already passed through the European Parliament Committee on Legal Affairs. So there's clearly some weight behind this, and it needs to be curtailed as soon as possible. And it needs to be curtailed by as many people as possible. So thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like to help boost this video up in the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe if you haven't.